Welcome to All Grown Up Now, Tales of a Checkered Past. I'm Kenneth D. King, podcasting from my studio near Union Square in New York City. This podcast is an evolution of the tale, All Grown Up Now, A Friendship in 3 Acts. This is Season 2, and it's called Tales of a Checkered Past. It's a collection of short stories from my salad days on up to the present. In each podcast, another self-contained story will be presented. Enjoy. With Father's Day coming up shortly, I just wanted to rerun this one podcast that I call Who's Wilbur? To talk about my father, because Wilbur Dean King is a presence that sort of is absent in a lot of the stories I tell. Here is his story. The place, San Francisco. The time is mid-1990. During one of my therapy sessions, the topic of Dad and the seance came up. Dennis was curious. He asked me about Dad, and my first response was, the most vivid memory I have of him is the day after he died. Really, Dennis asked. Yeah, I said. I awoke to see him sitting on the bed beside me. I looked up and said to him that I thought he had died yesterday, and he replied that yes, he did, but he wanted to come back to tell me that everything was going to be okay. I blinked and he was gone, along with my childhood. That was the first time I ever put it into words. Dad died 5 days after Christmas on December 30th, 1968. I was 10 years old. It was a Monday, and he had a heart attack while driving to work at a power plant somewhere in western Kansas. He stopped at the hospital in Ellsworth, thinking he had indigestion, and was a goner before they got his boots off. The word went out quickly. There was a standing room only funeral at Trinity Methodist Church because the funeral home was too small, with people coming in from all 50 states and a few foreign countries. The place was absolutely packed. From what I heard tell over the years, Dad was a popular guy and knew many different people from his various lives. The war, college, life before he married Mom, the National Guard, the Shriners, they all came. The entire Air National Guard unit Dad belonged to showed up in uniform to give tribute. I'd never seen anything like it. It was a real shock for everyone, especially Mom, who, I think, really didn't appreciate what she had until he was gone. Dad's death threw her into a long period of mourning, which I remember mainly because she really wasn't there. Not to eat, not to comfort us kids, not even to shriek at us occasionally, the activity she most enjoyed. She was blank with grief. I remember one time watching her right after he died. She was looking out the front door. She looked like someone who realized too late just how good she had it. But life eventually went on. She started shrieking again. She got remarried. We moved to Oklahoma. And the rest, as they say, is history. During my adolescence, Dad was just a shadowy memory. I think of this shadowy memory as Saint Daddy. Since I was only 10 when he died, and he traveled so much, I never really had much of a memory of what he was like as a person. My memories are more history, incidents, and occasions. Saint Daddy was a mythic figure who could do no wrong, and his passing divided life into 2 distinct periods, especially for Lori. She's never recovered from his death. These periods were before Daddy died and after Daddy died. Before Daddy died was a golden age where life was one stream of happiness and contentment and Kodak moments, whereas after Daddy died was a veil of tears, a grim life with no glimmers of happiness. I actually couldn't distinguish between the two. To me, they were both periods to be endured until I became a grown-up. St. Daddy was a font of knowledge, as he graduated with honors, straight A's actually, in college, had perfect pitch, usually told me when I was practicing the violin and badly, and a talented mathematician. I remember him patiently trying to explain fractions to Lori. I understood him long before she did. St. Daddy was a pillar of self-discipline. He quit drinking just like that, and smoking too, after the doctor told him to, and never took it up again. And he was a high standard of all that was manly, the one that I personally was held to whenever I was perceived to fall short. You know, you run and throw like a girl. What would your father say? St. Daddy was also a talented woodworker. He had a little shop in the basement where he made furniture and worked on his other projects. In this, he was just like Grandpa Yockers, Mom's dad, whose tools he used. Grandpa Yockers used to hide out in the back of the garage where his workshop was to get away from Grandma. Dad's father also had a workshop and made furniture, and his mother also wore the pants in the family. So Dad and Mom were a perfect match. They knew each other. Perhaps a little information about the man himself is in order here. I'm just relying on what I remember being told for some of this, but that's the way these things work out sometime. Dad was born Wilbur Dean King on May 19th, 1923, in Hayburn, Idaho, to Kenneth Francis King and his wife Gertie. He was an only child. Gertie almost died in childbirth, so the legend has it that Dad was cherished and spoiled. Gertie kept scrapbooks of little Wilbur all through his growing up years. I remember these. They were stored in our basement in a blonde wood bookcase that Dad had made in his workshop. I would pull them out to look at from time to time. Little Wilbur was quite creative with his watercolors and loved his mother. There were quite a few pictures he made for her in the scrapbooks, telling her how wonderful and beautiful she was and how he loved her. "I love you, Mommy! I love you, Mommy!" they screamed, with lots of purple flowers. Little Wilbur also had an early love of photography. Well, posing at first, but later he took pictures himself. So Gertie documented family life in photo albums as well. Grandpa was in some of the photos, but didn't seem to be a dominant presence. Wilbur graduated from Hayburn High School in 1941. He was class president his senior year, class vice president the year before. He also made the honor roll in 1940 and 1941, as well as being in theater and music. I still have his class pin awards to prove it, still pinned to the scrap of dark blue velveteen that Gertie attached them to all those years ago. When I was a child, this scrap of fabric lived in Mom's jewelry box, and I inherited it. After high school, the scrapbooks show Wilbur went to college for a year or so before going off to the war. Wilbur's yearbooks from this time had him in the orchestra playing piano, the band playing trumpet, president of the student council, and I believe he was in theater as well. There was definitely a pattern. The scrapbooks ended when Gertie died of cancer in 1949. After Gertie died, Grandpa married this vile woman named Mary, a hypocritical Mormon who drank coffee, dyed her hair Superman blue-black, had gaps between her teeth, blue-white skin, and played around on her husband, which is how she met Grandpa. Dad hated her and wouldn't allow us to call her Grandma. We had to call her Mary. He was very clear on that. On the very rare occasions when Grandpa and Mary would visit, they were made to stay in a hotel because Mary was so odious. Mary would tell Mom that she planned to be buried in a black lace negligee, so Grandpa would choose her over Gertie on the other side. She was also a kleptomaniac, and we were instructed to put away the good stuff before she visited. Mary was one hateful piece of work. On the night before Dad's funeral, she asked Mom to alter a coat she got for Christmas so she could wear it to the funeral. Miss Ann got out her pinking shears, gave her a look, and said, "Yeah, I'd love to." That ended that discussion. Years later, when Lori was on her genealogy kick, she researched all the Mormon archives and discovered that, after Grandpa died, Mary had baptized him and Dad both by proxy to the Mormon Church. I don't know the particulars on just how they do this peculiar thing or why, except perhaps they have way too much spare time on their hands. But Mom was absolutely apoplectic when she heard. Dad was a Mason and hated Mary and the Mormon Church and was no doubt at that very moment spinning in his grave because of all of this. Mom called her lawyer Harry. Being the voice of reason, Harry advised her that churches could do whatever they want and suing them won't change things. Besides, the Mormons had far more money for litigation than she did. Lori, of course, in her clueless way, thought it was cool that Dad showed up in the Mormon records. She never understood what the fuss was about. In World War II, Wilbur was in the Air Force and flew bombing missions over Europe. As I remember it, he also flew the Champagne runs from France to England, running champagne for Churchill after the region of Champagne had been liberated. Somewhat of a glamorous assignment for sure. Then, once back from the war, he continued his passion for airplanes and flight. On the walls of his office at the shop, there were photos of different airplanes he either had flown or wanted to fly. He even had his silk flight maps from the war mounted on large boards hanging on a wall in the basement. I eventually took them off the boards and now have them stored away. After the war, Wilbur went back to college and studied electrical engineering, and there was no trace of his previous artistic threads. I remember looking through some slides from this decade. The ones before the war, judging by the dates printed on them, were very artistic bohemian, with one series shot in this hunter green living room filled with Noguchi-inspired furniture, black lacquer, and salmon pink boucle upholstery. There was a gal who had the whole black turtleneck, red lipstick, haircut with nail scissors thing going, and my guess was that they were listening to jazz. It looked very avant-garde for the time. The slides from the post-war period were of power plants and electrical installations and airplanes. Lots of airplanes. After college, Will, or WD as he was known, went to work for General Electric in Cincinnati, where he met his future business partners, Bill Horton and A.V. Gardner. I still have the sterling silver GE electric motor cufflinks he got as an award while working there. The three partners eventually bought a bankrupt electric motor winding concern in Salina, Kansas, called Mid-States Armature Works. It's actually still around, but now called Mid-States Energy Works. These three guys turned it into a business that made switchboards and such for power plants, airports, and other industrial applications. This was before Wilbur met Miss Ann. Dad met Mom through Ruth Wilkie. Mom and Ruth were best friends who met because they looked so similar that they were often mistaken for one another. Ruth and Mom both worked in banks, Mom for Bank of America and Ruth for First Savings. Ruth was from Germany, one of the refugees from Berlin who made it to the U.S. She ended up in Salina because the only sponsors she could find lived there, God help her. One afternoon, Ruth and Mom were trying out Ruth's new Polaroid camera by taking pictures of each other in the cemetery, posing on the monuments. Why did they do that? And later, they had a double date. Ruth with her boyfriend, Will, Annie with her boyfriend, Bob, for dinner at the plantation on North Broadway. At the end of dinner, Annie and Ruth had changed dates. Annie ended up with Wilbur, and Ruth ended up with Bob. Annie married Wilbur, and Ruth married Bob twice, but I have no information. There you have it. Ruth had her Polaroid camera along on the date. A photograph was taken. For years, Miss Ann kept in her wallet a Polaroid photo of that night with the four of them in a round corner banquette, looking young and stylish and smiling for the camera. Mom and Dad were engaged in April of 1955 and married in September of 1955. Lori was born in February of 1956, and this explains the enormous bridal bouquet that Mom carried. Years later, I would hear Grandma and Mom argue whether it was 1954, Grandma, or 1955, Mom. By that time, I knew what was what, and I could count to 9. Their argument just drew the attention to the fact. I remember Mom telling me that Dad was hungover on their wedding day. You can see it in the photos. He had been drinking heavily the day before, and all through the rehearsal and the dinner. She got angry with him and told him that he had to choose between the bottle and her, and she wasn't going to marry him the next day. However, Grandma told her in no uncertain terms that she was getting married. Goddamn, that cake cost $100, and then there was that little thing in the oven. Lori was born in February of 1956. So Dad waited all night on the steps of the church, and when she arrived, he went to get ready for the wedding. But the drinking went on, though we kids never saw him drunk. Mom made sure of it. Their song was Stardust. For a wedding present, Dad got Mom the gold compact that plays Stardust, the one she gave me that last Christmas. This established a pattern. He got her really nice, stylish gifts, which she never used. Good handbags and gloves and expensive perfume. This is where I first saw the word Balenciaga, none of which she would use. She was always saving it for good. The newlyweds moved into a new house that Dad had bought before they married at 906 Willow. It was one of those post-war ticky-tacky boxes built on a concrete slab with no basement. Basements, of course, are really useful in tornado country, and only the most lowly of housing went without them. This was certainly a starter home, judging from the home movies, and the kitchen was painted chartreuse. As I said, Lori was born in 1956. Judging from the home movies and photo albums, she was treated like a little princess. Legend goes that Dad had the mumps, and it supposedly rendered him sterile, so Lori, who looked exactly like him, was regarded as a little miracle. However, I came along on February 18, 1958, after we had moved to the larger house on Wesley Street, and Kathy arrived on February 12, 1959. Lori was born on February 16th. You remember, Dad's birthday was May 19th. For our slower readers, that's 9 months. Probably the only time he got it, so he had to make it count. If you were to ask what I remember most about Dad, I would say his smell. It was a combination of sweat and machine shop, with faint whiffs of nicotine and occasionally alcohol. He worked in the shop, as he called it, wearing gray uniform shirts and pants and leather work boots, his work clothes. His pants held up with a thin brown leather belt with a University of Idaho buckle, which I have today and I still wear. Dad would come home from work smelling like sweat and the shop. In the summer here in New York City, the subway smells like the machine shop, and it reminds me of him. Dad was away quite a bit traveling to power plants around Kansas. When he came home on weekends, he used to say to me, "Someday we'll fill in the blank." In his case, someday never came. Every now and again, Dad would bring me home old gauges and such from the shop for me to play with and take apart. I never seemed to get them back together again, but somehow it proved to be an education, as I have a way with mechanical things to this day. He traveled to the various power plants and other installations throughout the region, either in his car or by a small plane. When I was young, he took the training and tests to get his pilot's license. I remember going to the airport with Mom to sit in the car and watch Dad practice his flybys and touch-and-goes so he could get in the hours to keep his license current. He kept his pilot's license all his life. His partner Bill Horton had his own plane, but Dad would rent a Cessna or a Piper from the local airport when he wanted to fly somewhere. There were times that Dad would take me with him to go on a site when some work was being done. We would go there in the plane, and he would let me fly it with the other steering wheel by watching the wings and the gauge on the instrument panel and keeping them level with the horizon. I thought this was really cool. The most exciting time I remember was almost crashing into another plane. I just thought it was fun. Little did I know. As I said, airplanes were his one passion. Frequently, he would say that the perfect way to die was in an airplane. Once, he had to crash land an airplane in a field, which stopped the talk of dying in an airplane. It came too close to reality. The plane threw a rod in the motor, and the motor conked out. Afterwards, Dad got the damaged piston from the motor and had it mounted and framed with a little plaque that said, "Lest I forget." Didn't stop him from going up again, though. He was a member of the Air National Guard, eventually becoming a lieutenant colonel, which meant he got the scrambled eggs on the brim of his hat, much to his delight. This was one outlet for his love of flying, he was a navigator, and it got him away from home. He would be away at camp for a weekend or so a month and 2 weeks in the summer. It was during one of these camps in 1968 that he contracted hepatitis. He thought it was the flu. It was at this time that his doctor told him, because of the hepatitis, that he had to quit drinking because it was bad for the liver, and he decided to quit smoking as well. So he quit both cold turkey, St. Daddy did. Or this is how the legend goes. It was many years later when I found out the truth. Grandma took in ironing to make a little extra money. She did ironing for some of the guys who worked at the shop. They told her that since Mom had cut off Dad's pocket money, as she controlled the purse strings and hence the booze intake, she thought, he would just take money out of petty cash at work to buy the booze. He drank early and often and quit early enough so he didn't smell when he got home. Since Dad drank at work, the concern was that he might electrocute himself or someone else, which might explain the near miss he and I had in that airplane. Mom, of course, was never told. Their marriage, of course, had its affectionate side. We kids got to see them being playful. Water fights especially were a common occurrence during the summers. Miss Ann would be watering the hedges, always about the time Dad arrived home from work. She would tease him by spritzing him a little with the garden hose when he was getting out of the car, but the outcome was always her getting the garden hose shoved down the front of her blouse after he swam upstream to get the hose from her. Then there was the incident with the whipped cream. Now, we kids came home from lunch in grade school, and when Dad was in town, he came home as well. This particular day, Miss Ann had bought the new product, whipped cream in a can. She got it out of the refrigerator to show us. We were all so excited. Now, Dad was sitting at the table with his chair at a right angle to the table. Mom walked over, shaking the can, and she got a look on her face. She popped the cap off the can and patiently started outlining the collar on Dad's work shirt. We kids sat there gobsmacked. We didn't know what to make of this. She continued to patiently outline the pocket of the shirt and make dots of whipped cream on the shirt buttons. Now, the entire time, Dad sat there acting like nothing was happening. Then she started spraying a blob of whipped cream on his nose, and in a flash, he grabbed the can, threw her against the refrigerator, stuck the nozzle down her blouse, and let loose a spray of whipped cream. They were looking very meaningfully at each other when we were sitting there, wide-eyed. Dad looked at the clock and said, "Kids, time to go back to school." "No, Daddy, we go back at 12:30, Kathy said. No, you need to go back now." And we were rushed out the door and off to school. That evening, there was no whipped cream for dessert. "What whipped cream?" Miss Ann asked. The other memories I have of both of my parents center around Christmas. I remember Dad being the one behind the wind-up movie camera with the blinding spotlights while we opened packages on Christmas morning, which meant he never showed up in any of these films. Christmas gifts figure into other memories I have as well. One year, Miss Ann got him a Rolex watch. That day, I was in the jewelry store with her, and I remember her telling the salesman, "This one, if he wants to buy me something, this ring." The box that appeared under the tree was huge and clanked when Miss Ann shook it, which she did being home all day. The Christmas season was gloomy, and I know Dad went to heaven when he died because Mom said she made his life hell because that box clanked. She thought he had gotten her another appliance. On Christmas Eve, he said, "Annie, don't you want to open your last gift?" She opened the box without much enthusiasm. Inside was another box, and another, and another, and another, and another, and another, and another. And then finally, there was a tiny box from the jeweler, and inside was the ring, which made me feel this small, Mom would say when telling the story, as well she should have. The next year, Miss Ann coveted a particular dining room set and went to visit it regularly at the furniture store. Close to Christmas, there appeared sold tags on it, but the sold to section on the tags was left blank. Dad's life was hell for the rest of the season. On Christmas morning, there was a tiny package under the tree for Miss Ann. Thinking that he had bought her another piece of jewelry, imagine being chagrined about that, but she was. She unwrapped the package to find a piece of paper. It was the sales slip for the dining room set. The doorbell rang just about then, and the delivery men brought it up and set it up on Christmas Day. The big pair of memories, though, that I remember are regarding cars, that ultimate means of escape when I was a kid. In 1966, it was Dad's turn to get the new company car. It was a big, metallic aquamarine blue Pontiac Catalina four-door land barge. I remember him coming home for lunch, walking proudly up the driveway, grinning from ear to ear about his new car. "Oh, Will, it doesn't match the house," Miss Ann remarked, disappointed, and his face fell. Fast forward to November 1968. It was his turn again to get the new company car. He arrived home driving a sea green metallic Pontiac Bonneville, a step up, and it matched the house. "Oh, Will, you didn't have to get it to match the house," Miss Ann exclaimed. She was never satisfied, or more to the point, he could never satisfy her. A month later, he was dead. He'd had enough. As I said, my most vivid memory of my dad was the day after he died. I awoke to see him sitting on the bed beside me. That was the last time I spoke with him, until the seance. At the seance, he left me with this: "Ken, I admire the way you've taken a bite out of life. You've done things I never would have had the nerve to do." Having the opportunity to communicate with him, to understand more of what his situation was, gave me more of a sense of who he was as a person. My wish was that I could have known him as an adult, but that was not to be. Knowing that he's keeping track of me and admires how I'm progressing gives me strength. I feel more male now after communicating with him. He makes his presence known even now from time to time. When I smell the subway smell, I think of my dad. Thanks for listening. You can get the audiobook All Grown Up Now on iTunes, Audible, and Amazon, or from my website, allgrownupnow.com. You can subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, SoundCloud, Stitcher, Spotify, and Google Play. If you have any questions, you can reach me through the website, allgrownupnow.com. You can follow me on Instagram at Kenneth D. King, on Facebook at Kenneth D. King Design, or on my main website, kennethdking.com.